What's up guys, this is Yacineygo. So I figured I never really made a video sharing my insight and opinion on the current format, especially not since Ryzeal was around. Is Yu-Gi-Oh really headed into the right direction? And also, is this like a tier 0 format or whatever? Anyways, before we go any further, y'all know the drill. Of course, as always, smash the like and subscribe button. It really motivates me a lot to keep existing, and also, check out my website for Blue Eyes and Crystron spreadsheets, as well as the coaching. And with that being said, let's get right into it. Okay, so first things first, is Ryzeal a tier 0 deck? Well, I mean, it doesn't really matter too much. Usually people are kind of like a little too obsessed with numbers and a definition that doesn't even exist. They go, oh yeah, you know, if the deck doesn't have a 65+% representation in top cut, then it cannot be deemed a tier 0 deck. But that doesn't really make any sense, because if the deck gets a 64% representation, does that mean the deck is no longer, it's just not a tier 0 deck? Like that just, it's asinine. So I think it's the definition of tier 0 is very vague, and it just shouldn't really be a thing. For me, it's more of like a vibe, you know, like, oh, the deck feels like tier 0. And in the past YCSs, we've been seeing that Ryzeal variants, so all of them, represent anywhere between 50 to like 56% representation in top cut slots, which is a lot. And obviously when you add that to like the 30% that Maliss is currently doing, then we've got like 85-ish% among just 2 decks. And then the rest of the 15% is everything else. So usually it's like White Forest, Mermail, Memento, Tenpai, and then some others decks, like Din Kabui played Fire King. Crystron got a YCS top, actually a YCS Birmingham, and some other small decks. I mean, they see a little play, but they don't really do too well. It's actually funny, because they used to be like pretty good decks. I mean, Ubel and Voices Voice, and now they're just doing nothing. And there's some other decks that might be even better than that. But now we also have Blue Eyes, which is why things are about to change a little bit. And also, what I find to be the most interesting about this format is that we're kind of going back in time, because we discovered something and we are now saying, you know what, screw those discoveries, we're actually going to revert back to square one. What I'm trying to say is, when the set that introduced Ryzeal and Maliss just came out, I forgot what was the exact name. I think it's like Crossover Breakers, but I could be wrong. Yeah, when that set just came out, everybody was playing Ryzeal as a pure Ryzeal deck. They weren't really playing Ryzeal Fiendsmith yet, because they didn't really think of it yet. I mean, obviously some players were. It saw like a decent amount of representation in YCS Anaheim, and it was even the deck that ended up winning the whole thing. But now, I mean, at least like up until like a few days or weeks ago, Ryzeal Fiendsmith was by far the most popular build, and then Ryzeal Mitsurugi was also popular. But now pure Ryzeal is completely dominating in representation, like by a significant margin, and it is back to being the #1 most played version of the deck. And the reason for that is because in a world where people are playing, you know, Drill and Logbird to counter the Mitsurugi build, or Bystios to counter the Fiendsmith cards, maybe pure Ryzeal is the deck that suffers the least amount of collateral damage. But then that also means that other cards that previously weren't great against it, like Dimensional Bearer for example, are now back to being good, because Dimensional Bearer against Mitsurugi and Ryzeal and Fiendsmith Ryzeal, fine, but it's not like necessarily a turn skip, because what are you gonna do? Like Call Xyz? Okay, sure, they can Ritual Summon, and then against the Fiendsmith build, well, they can still do Fiendsmith things. They can make DS Ire, they can still kill you with Agnum Day into battle phase. But yeah, I think Ryzeal, it's really interesting what I'm about to say about the deck, but I actually think that pure Ryzeal is actually a very good deck. I mean, a very healthy deck to have around as the #1 best deck, because even though it's a great deck, even though it's like top tier and it's the #1 best deck, well, obviously it's the most played deck, I still think that it is very fair to play against, because you can afford to like not draw hand shops, just draw like one board breaker, and it might be enough. Whereas against decks like Mitsurugi Ryzeal and Fiendsmith Ryzeal, for example, they're making Omni Negates. Like, this deck can make the trap card, even though not everybody's playing it. But either way, the deck is like super layered in terms of the interruptions that it can do, so even if you have a board breaker, it's not going to do anything. And against the Fiendsmith Ryzeal, same thing, super layered. It can have grave interruptions, it can have DS Ire technically, it can have Caesar to negate Metal Tronus if it's used on Detonator, so you're forced to go Metal Tronus on Caesar, which is less optimal. And also, do you have the targets in your extra deck? Sometimes not. So that can be a little frustrating. And against pure Ryzeal, I feel like almost any board breaker can be enough to just completely demolish the board. And I think this is a good thing for the game. So yeah, it's like I said, it's really nice to have pure Ryzeal as the #1 deck right now. And I think because of that, then we're gonna start seeing some other interesting decks just creep back up into the metagame, and you will understand why I'm saying this in just a minute. But yeah, anyways, the number 2 most played deck obviously is Maliss, and that deck I think it's more frustrating to play against than Ryzeal, because unlike Ryzeal, this deck, if you don't draw like a specific anti-Maliss card, the game is already over. This is more of like an FTK deck. It's not a fair deck at all. End boards are completely unbreakable. There is not a lot of cards in the game that can really deal with Maliss. But what really pisses me off is the fact that the cards that do deal with Maliss are way too unfair against it. It's cards like Artifact Lancia, the Molchami, Yalis, and Furos, etc., Chaos Hunter, Nibiru. Those cards, if you use them correctly, I mean, Lancia, you don't really have to use it correctly, but the other cards, I guess, if you use them like well against Maliss, it really just does cripple them. And if you just draw a hand like full of Maliss cards, then obviously it's gonna demolish you. So you have to draw like the right combination of like Maliss and like non-engine cards so that it's fine if you get a hand shot, because you can still floodgate your opponent out of the game. I'm not a big fan of the existence of this deck. I think this is like the one deck that we can actually remove from the metagame completely. Ryzeal, it would just have to get like a little nerf, because obviously I think it's, like I said, it's nice to have around and just slow down the metagame, because before Ryzeal it was just like Yubel and the Azamina, Snake Eye, and Farking decks that were like completely broken, and those decks were even less interactive than any of these decks right here. They were on the same level as Maliss. Like if you don't draw the right amount of hand shops and stuff like that, you are just dying. Like I said, it's really nice to have a mid-range deck being the number 1 deck, because it's very reminiscent to like Tenyi Sword Soul, where you could lose the dice roll against your opponent, and just with like a handful of engine and very good technical play, you can still naturally break the board. But yeah, anyways, we now have Blue Eyes, I mean, being a part of the metagame, which, I mean, it doesn't really change anything. Like, it doesn't change the fact that these decks are still the top tier decks. Blue Eyes doesn't necessarily have any good matchup here. It also doesn't necessarily have like a terrible matchup, but I wouldn't say Maliss is like favorable at all. I would actually say that Maliss definitely gets like a 55 to 60 in their favor. It's not really looking good for Blue Eyes, because they have to suffer a lot of cards. I mean, they have to lose to like Dominus Impulse, Shifter, Bestials, which this deck can clearly main deck, so that's kind of rough. And Blue Eyes, all the cards that they can play against Maliss, they're in the side deck. So again, another issue with Maliss is just all the good cards against them, you're not seeing them on game 1, and then all the broken cards are in the side deck. If you're a Maliss player yourself, you will be undergoing the frustration of having to deal with Lancia and all those annoying cards every single round, sometimes multiple times per match. It might ruin your day completely. But yeah, back to Blue Eyes, this deck, I actually realized that it doesn't have the ability to like naturally beat Ryzeal Detonator just with engine. Like for example, let's just say that you have like Primite, another barrel, and Sage, Maiden, Wishes, whatever, and Load or something. It doesn't really matter too much. It's a lot of different cards, and it still loses to one single Ryzeal Detonator with like 4 pops, because you can go normal barrel effect, and then you place the load, you get popped there, and then you flip the load, search, you get popped there, so you don't search, so Drill Beam is never a part of your hand, because Drill Beam is unsearchable under Detonator, because the only ways to search it would be with load, which obviously won't resolve, and you can set it with barrel, but obviously you can't flip it during the turn it was set. And then your Maiden can place the True Light, and then you go True Light effect, you get popped, and then you obviously lose your board. And then you can go Wishes to surge the Roar, summon Blue Eyes, revive back the Maiden, and then you go Wishes effect target, and then you get popped there, and then you still can't out the Detonator. And even if you have like 1 extra push, then obviously you still lose, because your opponent still has follow-up, obviously, and then you've got pretty much nothing other than 1 Spirit Dragon. And unfortunately, it's just not enough to really beat Ryzeal going second, so you absolutely desperately need specific cards like Metal Chonus, Ultimate Slayer, Imperm, and stuff like that to actually deal with the Detonator itself, simply because your engine does not have the tools and resources to do so, and this really is frustrating. Maliss has the exact same problem. If you go second against Ryzeal Detonator and you draw 5 Maliss cards, you lose. The only difference is that this deck plays more cards that can deal with Detonator than Blue Eyes, because this deck still plays like, you know, Druid's Worm main deck, whereas a lot of the Blue Eyes deck that Blue Eyes deck list that I'm looking at, they don't really play Druid's Worm at all. And also you got Metal Chonus in the main deck for some Maliss players, whereas again with Blue Eyes I'm not really seeing that. But yeah, it's a really fun deck and really just powerful deck overall to have in the format, and I'm actually really happy that Blue Eyes is around. And I think in a perfect world, this deck will always remain in the top 5 best decks, because it is not unfair to play against. It feels nice to play with. It's just overall, I think, exactly what this game should embody. Just a deck that is always nice, and also it represents your personality. I think a lot of people are playing Blue Eyes because they enjoy the deck, not necessarily because they're oh, meta sheep and they're just trying to play the best deck. I don't really like using that expression, but you get what I'm trying to say. They're not playing Blue Eyes just because it's good. They play Blue Eyes because they like Blue Eyes. But yeah, anyways, other decks like White Forest, Mermail, Memento, all these decks are really strong, and they all top YCSs. I mean, they have topped YCSs numerous times ever since they were around, especially now that White Forest got more support, and it's also about to get even more support on Alliance Insight. So I would really keep an eye out on the existence of this deck. I mean, it's a really cool strategy overall, but it also doesn't deal with Ryzeal Detonator. Again, it's really frustrating, and I think this deck is just strictly worse to play than almost like anything here, just because it has like no real edge. Like I mean, I guess people misplay against you, but you still lose to like all the cards that Ryzeal and like Blue Eyes lose to. You still lose to Bestials, you still lose to like Droll and stuff like that, Furos, Pyrolia. It's not a good time. It just, yeah, it can sometimes you just lose to like one Ash or one Veiler. That's gonna happen less often, but again, you get what I'm saying. And then Mermail, this deck on paper looks completely broken, very similar as Maliss when it goes first. The issue with with Mermail, is that when you're eating cards like Abyss Dweller, that obviously Ryzeal can summon super easy, your deck goes from broken to complete garbage, which is again another thing that I don't like. So if cards like Abyss Dweller can get banned, then we can really re-evaluate the power level of these other strategies, which would be very good. And also, it's not like you can say, oh, well, we need Dweller to keep those decks in checks. The decks in check, because I think this deck is still not able to play as many non-engine as the other decks out there, even though you can technically do like 15. You're doing like 15 maybe in like 42, 43 cards, maybe 40 if you're really trying to push it, but I don't know. But yeah, if I had to really like suggest like a hit on the ban list, I don't really know. Maybe I was gonna say like Ryzeal Detonator kind of gets like kind of needs a nerf, but what are we gonna do? You can't really ban the card. That would be a little overkill. Are we limiting X Ryzeal? Are we limiting Bonfire? We could do that. That would definitely make sense, because in the OCG we saw that this is what ended up happening, and it really was enough to make to really make a big difference for the Ryzeal deck. But then they ended up getting Star Ryzeal right after, so it ended up changing absolutely nothing, because now the deck is just back to being super resilient and not caring about hand traps. And since we're about to get 7 Tachyon in Maze of the Master coming out in a few weeks, it's also going to nullify whatever consistency nerf that you're trying to bring to the deck, because we're adding 6 more starters to the deck, so clearly Ryzeal needs a nerf. Otherwise it's going to be way too consistent, way too resilient, and it's just gonna feel very frustrating to play against when you draw, you know, a bunch of hand traps that really just do nothing. You feel like you're hand looping yourself, and then you don't have the cards that can deal with the detonator itself. Like your Imperm, are you using it for the duo drive, or are you holding it for the detonator? Regardless of what decision you make, you are going to lose. So yeah, I think that's something that people are going to be very angry with when the time will come. But yeah, every single one of these decks out there, I mean, Tenpai, Crystron, Fire King, and these quote-unquote rogue decks, they're all super interesting to play, and they're also like very fun, except maybe for Tenpai. But yeah, it's just unfortunate that, again, it's always the same issue, right? Like, there are decks that have like very similar pros as the top tier decks, but the cons are also kind of like the same. It's just that they're less consistent for the most part and less degenerate, but the advantage that you get from playing them is that people will be misplaying against you, and also they won't be prepared, so they will do all kinds of wrong things. Whereas if you play Ryzeal, then everybody is going to play perfectly against you, which is a big thing with established formats. So yeah, moral of the story, I do like this format. I would give it like an 8 out of 10, because there's always room for improvement, and I think that we're very close to having almost a borderline perfect format. It's just that we would need like a few adjustments, and I don't think that we need to follow what the OCG did. Even though I think it's a good start, it's just not enough, because we already know that we're about to get 6 more starters and Star Ryzeal in Alliance Insight. That is a fact. So even if we limit X Ryzeal, it might just not be enough. I think we're gonna have to do something more drastic. I was thinking like ban Mirror Logic Aggregator, but that doesn't really make any sense. And then for the Maliss deck, we need to actually demolish that deck, unfortunately. It's not really the kind of deck that we can just let it survive. It's just, again, it's not fair in the way it operates. It can play a huge amount of hand traps. The support from Alliance Insight is completely ridiculous, because now it doesn't even lose to like Lancia and Nibiru anymore, like at all. So that's another problem that I've got. But yeah, you guys let me know how you feel about this format in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys very soon. Peace.